The engines always get the spotlight, and rightfully so. That's where all the action's at. But in the case of iconic passenger trains, we can't ignore the supporting cast behind them. These passenger cars. Wouldn't be much of a passenger train without cars. Today, we're going to look at two icons of the Union Pacific and their distinctly different passenger car sets. Both of these are made by MTH under the RailKing banner, and these are some of my favorites to run. Want to see why? This is sort of a review, so if you've followed me for any amount of time, you'll know I always like to dig into a little history first. The two kinds of passenger trains we'll look at today would have operated around the same time. They would have kind of overlapped a bit. First up, being pulled by this Greyhound Challenger, are these Madison-style cars. These are also referred to as heavyweight passenger cars, and they certainly earned their name. You can visually identify these kinds of cars typically from their narrower windows, a generally kind of boxy riveted design, and these distinctive rounded rooftops. The roofs also have kind of this ledge running alongside the edges too. These cars were mostly being built in the 1920s and 30s and earned their heavyweight name, as they were built from materials like wood and steel. As passenger service demand grew, the longer trains became increasingly heavy for locomotives to pull. These cars here are painted in what's usually called the Greyhound colors. As a general rule of thumb, Union Pacific used this two-tone gray paint and lettering scheme for equipment assigned to non-streamliner passenger trains from early 1946 through mid-1952. They were meant to match a similar paint scheme in use by the Pullman Company, which you've probably heard that name a bunch of times, for other passenger cars since the late 1930s, including the 49er train, which operated between 1937 and 41. So if you saw a Greyhound paint scheme on a locomotive, it was likely destined for passenger duty. Depicted here is our mighty Challenger, which would have operated in the Pacific Northwest using these older style cars. They did overnight service specifically with these. The heavyweights had proven themselves through the abuse they took hauling troops during the war, and these Challengers pulled rebuilt versions of them with upgraded roller bearings to help them glide across the rails. These familiar Armour Yellow streamlined cars are still famously used today. Pulled behind Union Pacific's heritage engines and steam locomotives like Big Boy 4014, these cars propelled UP's passenger service into the future. While streamlining had been around for a while, it became much more common post-war as the longest and fastest passenger trains zoomed across the country in these bolder colors. Typically pulled by diesel locomotives that also matched the cars themselves, like this nice pair of F3s, it wasn't completely out of the question to still have a steam locomotive at the head end when needed. In fact, that's part of the reason the Greyhound scheme typically had a yellow pinstripe, so as to help match the cars behind it in case they were streamlined cars. These streamlined cars were lighter, faster, and featured more modern interior designing, meant to be brighter, and even had amenities like air conditioning. That was something that wasn't even the norm for most homes at the time. A signature staple of this can be seen in the form of a glass domed car. Dome liner service, as they were sometimes called, and even full-length dome cars became more common in passenger service in the 50s and 60s, giving passengers a unique view as they traveled. I could keep going on about the history of these kinds of passenger cars, but let's focus a bit back on the O-gauge representations that you've seen flying across the screen so far. As I mentioned before, both of these sets of passenger cars I'm running here are part of the RailKing line, which is considered to be semi-scale or non-scale. Essentially, these are slightly smaller than their 1/48 scale counterparts, but semi-scale is kind of an ambiguous term. It doesn't actually tell you how big or small they are. The slightly shorter length on these cars does help them navigate tighter turns with less overhang, but it also helps them match up to the locomotive's size in front a little bit better. And that's an important point I want to get out of the way right off the bat. Yeah, they're semi-scale, but they're really proportioned nicely, coming in just over 15 inches long per car. Most modern semi-scale cars, especially ones with like starter sets, are more like a 12-inch car. And that extra length makes a difference when pulled behind these kinds of trains. They're also incredibly detailed, which is something that often gets overlooked on other semi-scale offerings. There's metal handles on the sides and roofs, detailed exterior with nice paintwork to match, and even detailed and lit interiors. In the case of the heavyweight cars, there are even passengers inside, which is true of some of the RailKing cars. But as I found when I got this set, these were hot glued in place by the previous owner. Many of them had come loose during shipping and were getting tossed around, so I opened each one up, re-glued them, and even fixed some of the paint on them. I also noticed everyone had black hair, so I made it a point to try and add a little more variety to our passengers. Hey, it's the secondhand Overland for a reason, right? I expect some of these things to come in needing a little bit of TLC. I'm alright with that. Both of these designs of cars you see here are RailKing, but there are also smaller RailKing cars that are typically labeled as 027 right on the box. If you're looking for some of these longer cars, you want to check the box and also look for visual cues. The Streamlined cars that are smaller have flat edges even with the wheels, while the longer cars, like I have, curve under a bit more and have cutouts for the wheels instead. The same can be said for Madison-style cars, although it's a bit harder to tell visually which is which. I've picked up this baggage car that's the smaller 12-inch size compared to these 15-inch cars, and they look alright together, but it wasn't what I had intended. You'll want to pay close attention if you're buying these secondhand or even new. These cars look right at home behind my slightly larger semi-scale engines like the Lionmaster Challenger seen here. They go well with Lionmaster engines in general, so if you need a set for your T1 Duplex or Class A, there are heavyweight and streamlined versions that would go equally well with those. I was surprised to see that our Lion Chief F3s look perfect in front of these MTH Streamliners both in size and paint color. Color usually isn't something that looks right when you mix manufacturers, like Lionel mixing with K-Line, mixing with MTH, and etc. So, again, I'm very pleased with how this Lion Chief pairs with the MTH RailKing cars. And honestly, that's my favorite kind of way to run our trains these days. Lionel at the head end, with RailKing passenger cars and rolling stock. But let me know what you like to use. Do you have any of these in-between sized cars like this? Let me know down in the comments. If you're looking for passenger cars for your 3-rail trains, I highly recommend these RailKing options. They're long enough and detailed enough to look good behind just about any train, and they look especially good behind my beloved Lionmaster engines. They're not always easy to track down, but I did manage to find these Greyhound cars on trains.com, and I found these Streamlined cars at the York Train Show. I recommend finding the 4-car pack to start with and get an add-on car or two to fill things out. 4 cars seems a little too short for a passenger train, and I found that 5 or 6 seem to look a little more authentic, especially on longer straights. But it all depends on what you're running and how you're running them. So do your research and find the best fit for you. We've always got more videos in the works, so make sure you subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss what's next. Also, there's plenty of videos we've cranked out before, so check out those ones while you're at it. If you like these passenger cars, you'll love the engines we've reviewed here, so I've linked that playlist here at the end. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.